Jack, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you tell, like, my audio, it's not the best. Can you hear it?
It sounds good to me. I do notice that. So today we're on an Instagram call. Is there a reason why you weren't able to call from your phone regularly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I mentioned this last time. I'm in Mexico City right now. So, of course, no international calls.
And how's that experience so far? So I believe you flew there Saturday night, and got there early Sunday morning. So you've been there for what?
Well,
Almost
I mean
48
that
hours?
that is a nice way to you're making it sound much nicer than it was. So the plane, my flight was a Viva Aerobus flight from Chicago to Mexico City, and it left. You know when it left. You know when it left. It left. Well, the departure time, right? Officially, it was scheduled for 11:55 p.m., but in actuality, we left at like 12:30 a.m., which was ridiculous. And
Do you know why it was so delayed?
I mean, I that's a legitimate thing that I had no idea. I'm not sure if it might have just been like a mistake, because what happened was that like next to my flight was another Viva Aerobus flight from Chicago to Guadalajara, and they had the same delay. Like they were scheduled to depart at the same time as me, but they had the same delay, and they started, you know, they and once once the delay was over, they left like they started boarding and left at almost the same time. So I have a
Mm-hmm.
feeling that like it was just a mistake, that like the actual
Because
departure time.
I thought that those planes were at the airport well beforehand, so they could have just taxied to the gate earlier or just boarded earlier.
I mean, I have no idea, but we were one of the last flights of the night. Interestingly, some of the only last flights, some of the only last flights from Chicago are to Mexico. Um, so I guess that's sort of a pattern that there is.
And I know in past episodes we had, or in an episode we had pondered why the flight timing was so bad, because in the past you did mention you were considering taking this Viva Aerobus flight, but it seems that maybe it's just a slot issue that they have to land in Mexico City early in the morning and leave the U.S. or cities like Chicago late at night.
I mean,
Um,
it would also be a reason like why it's much cheaper. The flight itself without any baggage or whatever, it only costs 175 round trip, which is pretty good, especially from Chicago to Mexico, right? Like I saw, I was looking at the plane
mhm.
tickets, and then from even cities such as Washington or New York, it costs well into the three four hundreds. Um, so 175 was a pretty good bargain, even if it the times were bad,
Or
inconvenient.
albeit bad, yeah, and does Aeromexico fly that route? And because I would imagine that Viva Aerobus would be a lot cheaper than Aeromexico, or
Well, I mean,
even
of
and
course.
or United or American.
Well, of course, VivaAerobus is much cheaper than all of those. Right? Aeromexico is the big Mexican flag carrier. But I saw the ticket price on the same day for Aeromexico, and it was like what 428 compared to VivaAerobus's 175. And so I was like, yeah, I don't think this is a hard choice at all.
And how much did you end up paying for like the ancillary fees, like the bags, or the did you buy anything on board or stuff like that?
Yeah, so I actually brought like my instrument. I play a Chinese instrument, Yarhu. I brought that on board, and so that cost $60 um, for the round trip ticket for baggage fees, $30 one way, which is pretty
It's
good.
the
So in
same price as
total,
a Velo.
yeah. So I guess in total, I spent not 175 but 245 plus tax, which is still pretty good, I would say. Especially when considering compared to other airlines or other cities. But I did not, you know, I did not buy anything on board, which because VivaAerobus is a low cost carrier, so they charge for absolutely everything, including water. So there wasn't even the complimentary service, and also I didn't really need to because it was a flight from 12 a.m. to like 3:30 to 4 a.m. So
And so, what was the onboard catering like? Like, did they have options? Because I know that low cost carriers like Ryanair, for example, have a lot of food and drinks and other things you can buy on board. Was
I,
it pretty similar at Viva Aerobus?
I mean, have you flown a low cost carrier before?
Sorry, your audio cut out there a bit. I didn't hear your response.
Oh, sorry. Have you flown a low cost carrier before?
Besides a Velo, which I don't know if you count, I've flown on
Uh-huh.
Norwegian, which was I guess a pretty standard low cost carrier.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess Norwegian counts. Yeah. Did you get like? I mean, did you still have like complimentary meals and stuff on Norwegian?
No, for everything there you had to pay. I think they offered water if I remember correctly, but for everything else you had to pay. Um, so I didn't get any of it.
That's pretty rotten. That's pretty rotten. I mean, on
But I mean,
on.
you pay for it, so
I mean, I guess
like
so,
you're not
but
you're not paying much out of.
hmm hmm
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm. I mean, I guess so. Because it's sort of like on Viva Aerobus, it was sort of the same situation in that they the price is lower for that reason. But what was, and I guess it also makes sense because they didn't give out water, which I guess is another difference from, for example, Norwegian, which is long haul, and so you kind of have to give out water, eh?
I guess, and actually, well, the routes I flew on was domestic within Norway, so I think it was the longest flight I was on was 3 hours. So they were fairly short.
Oh,
Um, yeah, I've never flown Norwegian long haul before,
well, I mean, I presume it would
but
certainly be.
domestically it was.
I presume it would certainly be a lot different, eh?
Yeah, I mean they're on completely opposite sides of the world and different business models. So I mean, there's not like a lot of I guess consistency between every single low cost carrier, and through a lot of evaluative metrics. But it's interesting just to look at Viva Aerobus specifically because they have a lot of I guess unique qualities and unique uh, traits about them that are interesting to look at in the context of all of the entirety of Mexican aviation.
Hmm I mean, yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I've only had experience flying on Viva Aerobus, but of course, I can attest to for example, the flight itself. Right, the flight itself was um, decent, I suppose. The seats don't recline, which I guess is standard for a low cost carrier. Like I said, no service. Of course, no on uh, on flight, in flight entertainment either, um, and of course, not so great timing, which I guess are all characteristic of um, low cost carriers in general. But Mexico also has other airlines too, eh? Um, so let's talk about
They
those.
do. So yeah, obviously, I think as you would look at the booking process on a flight from Chicago to Mexico City, you have a lot of options, um, and a lot of competitors with Viva Aerobus. Um, I don't actually know which of the airlines operate that specific route, but I would say we have there's four-ish, depending on if you consider Interjet still operating major airlines. You have, like we've mentioned, Viva Aerobus. We have Aeromexico, which is also in bankruptcy. There's
Beautiful.
we have Volaris. Um, so those are like the bigger three, and then there's also Magna Charters, which still has some presence, but they're largely seasonal and not as big. So really, you have the big three of Aeromexico, VivaAerobus, and Volaris. But it is really interesting that two of those three are low cost.
I mean, it's also characteristic on this one route. So actually the route Chicago to Mexico City, it's operated actually by all three, which is pretty interesting, I'd say. Especially since that for low cost carriers, right? Chicago. Well, I mean, I see. Here's the thing, right? The situation in Mexican aviation is that a very good chunk of the demand comes from tourism, right? And where does that tourism money come from? Well, the two countries to the north, the United States and Canada, right? So there are a ton of, a ton of routes that operate, a ton of flights that operate between cities in the north and the Midwest of the U.S. and also Canada, especially during winter. The flights absolutely pour into Cancun and Cabo and all the rest. So I guess I would say Chicago to Mexico City. Although Mexico City is certainly not tourist, beach tourist resort. It is touristy as well, and I think the fact that all three of them operate this route just is a test to how much demand there is. Eh?
And even 2 years ago we had Interjet too, so that was 4 airlines operating some routes. I don't know actually if Interjet flew to O'Hare, but I would imagine there were routes in the U.S. where all 4 airlines were operating. But it is also interesting that just like there's 2 of the 3 are low cost, which I guess are inducive to creating demand and also supplying demand. But both VivaAerobus and Volaris are relatively new, both being founded both being founded and becoming big in the last 15, 20 years, as compared to Aeromexico, which has been established for a lot longer.
Yeah, I mean it's because again, right, the tourism factor is one, but there's also the two main areas of demand for aviation, to at least internationally to and from Mexico, right? Number one is tourists fleeing the harsh, brutal winters to the beaches of Mexico, and number two is the large population of Mexicans in the United States, right? Certainly certainly by the border, but also in the very big cities. There's a lot of the Mexican diaspora there. So the airlines are certainly seeking to capture that route market in these international routes.
Exactly, and I guess just so for reference, the industry is actually in a interesting state right now. Like I mentioned earlier, Aeromexico is in bankruptcy, and I would say things are really changing because at least I don't know 10, 15 years ago we had a much different market. Primarily, we had Aeromexico obviously being dominant, but there was also a fierce competitor in Mexicana de Aviación, which was also huge and at one point in Starlines and later in One World. And now we go from that to a situation where the big airline Aeromexico is in bankruptcy. You have Interjet, which is essentially gone. They suspended operations in December, and then you're just left with VivaAerobus and Volaris, which have managed to do really well. And actually, Volaris is now the largest domestic airline in terms of market share in the country, with around 30%. Which is astounding given that for so long Aeromexico dominated. So it's actually really interesting to see the changes in the industry. And I'm actually curious why, like specifically what traits of Aeromexico, I guess, make it more susceptible to failure. I mean, obviously it could be its large size or its aircraft problems that Interjet had.
Well, I mean, it's certainly. Well, it's certainly not, anything to do with the aircraft itself, the airplanes that Aeromexico has, right? But I did see this one article headline recently that went something along the lines of big companies, business travel isn't coming back, right? Like it isn't going to be the same ever again, which I think is pretty revealing, because if you actually think about it, right, the way how we usually conceive business travel in aviation, it is pretty interesting to say the least. But especially, of course, right? Again, because of COVID, so much is going is turning virtual, and there's also not a big demand to go back to in person things, right? And so that's where I think you can really see the contrast because between Aeromexico and Volaris and VivaAerobus. Aeromexico, of course, is the big, national flag carrier based out of Mexico City, connecting all the other international countries, connecting all other countries with Mexico and offering, some connections, domestically as well. Whereas the other two are certainly, much more keen on simply, getting demand in key markets, right? Offering lower prices to customers. And that's what's really made them more successful, I think, than Aeromexico. Because Aeromexico has killed off, because COVID has killed off most of the essential business travel. And especially because, the COVID situation in Mexico is not great, right? It's been a tough road.
And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, like Volaris has managed to keep load factors really high. They're at 87% at least earlier this year with COVID on the flights that they're operating. So that they've done really well. But like Aeromexico, especially, their executives have highlighted the COVID pandemic has really exacerbated a lot of the existing financial struggles they faced. And actually, I did say aircraft problems, thinking that they have had some in the form of the 737 MAX, which they've had to ground for a while, obviously, with it being grounded for like a year or whatever it was grounded for. That did affect some of their routing and scheduling, because at least before it was grounded, it was a pretty effective plane in filling a lot of demand and operating fuel efficiently. And there were certainly concerns, I would assume from the airline, that it could turn out to be similar to the Interjet situation with the Superjet, which, for reference, Interjet in 2012 made a huge order for some Sukhoi Superjet 100s from Russia, which had previously not even been tested or used at all on the North American continent. So a lot of people thought optimistically that Interjet got a good deal. But in retrospect, all of the planes they got were really unreliable, and they ended up grounding or not being able to use most of them, which ended up really harming them financially. So I think there was concerns on the Aeromexico side of things that if the 737 MAX wasn't allowed to fly again anytime soon, that could be detrimental. But it is coming back.
Aeromexico, even as recently as July 2021, right? They ordered an additional 12 Boeing 737 Maxes. So I don't know. I mean, I guess they did regain some confidence in the aircraft.
It seems that way, and it seems like they're confident they can reemerge from bankruptcy soon. They did declare bankruptcy, I believe it was last year, in the summer after COVID. So they've had some time to get through it, and obviously they're still flying through the pandemic, and trying to grow. They have a lot of new orders coming in. I think not to mention the 737 MAX, but other planes as well in the coming years. So they're certainly growing and not really concerned from a financial standpoint. And they certainly have the ability to be profitable once demand returns. But like you mentioned, they need, I guess, some to be competitive with Volaris and VivaAerobus, especially because business demand isn't going to be the same. And if most of those customers are going to go to airlines like Volaris and VivaAerobus, which have demonstratedly lower prices time and time again, I mean, it's going to be really difficult for Aeromexico to succeed, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, especially when the big profits are all, trying to save as much money as possible, at least At least, and also because since Mexico, because of COVID, right? Travel restrictions between Mexico and much of the world are still very much limited. Um, so it's like for example, Aeromexico's although it was small, but their entire network to Asia is cut off. Much of it to Europe was cut off as well because many European countries are requiring quarantine for Mexican citizens. The big market of the United States is there, of course, but the main source of revenue of business travelers has almost vanished. So I think it's certainly a tough road for. It's certainly a tough road for the airline, especially when it faces the two other competitors, Volaris and VivaAerobus, who are as expansion, who has as as keen on expansion as they are right now. But I do want to actually talk a little bit about those two airlines as well. So actually, Jack, can you start off about a bit about Volaris airline?
So they are obviously a ultra low cost carrier, who typically will have lower prices than even Viva Aerobus and definitely Aeromexico. And they started initially in 2003. I believe they started flying in 2006. But they are I guess pretty generic in what they in their routes. They kind of have a hub and spoke model. And like Interjet, they were pretty reluctant to start coming into the Mexico City market, and initially flew out of Toluca and some other big cities in Mexico. But they've grown very rapidly over the years. And in 2008, they signed a code-sharing deal with Southwest Airlines, which allowed them to operate a lot of flights into the U.S. and also then transfer to Southwest. And I have memories of flying Southwest home to San Diego a lot, and looking in the airport diagrams and talking about how you could transfer to Volaris in San Diego. So they're certainly well advertised. But yeah, they've been growing and they've been focusing on keeping prices low, but also offering, I guess, quality service. I mean, not obviously Aeromexico level, but I guess satisfactory. And also, interestingly, they've pushed a lot of. They've tried to grow a lot outside of Mexico. They've, I guess, operated more international flights. They've launched to San Francisco and some other cities in the U.S. in recent years. But they're also now trying to launch actually a subsidiary in El Salvador to, I guess, fill in some of the market there. I mean, there is Avianca, obviously, but certainly there's more demand that they can fill on the low cost side of things that really isn't as readily available in Central America. So I would consider them at least the more dominant low cost carrier in the region as compared to VivaAerobus.
Well, yeah, I mean one of the actually, let's actually bring up the topic of the different hubs of these airlines, right? Aeromexico really only does have a big presence at Mexico City, right? It offers flights to most big cities in Mexico as well as major cities across the world. The problem, however, is that Mexico certainly has other very large cities as well. So for example, Guadalajara, right? Guadalajara, I'm looking at the list right now. VivaAerobus and Volaris are both very much dominant at Guadalajara. They have, well over, tons, lots and lots of flights to and from Guadalajara. Aeromexico has a total of 7 flights to Guadalajara, and one of them is to Mexico City, right? That's also an interesting point because whilst Aeromexico has like nearly no presence at Guadalajara, VivaAerobus and Volaris also have a lot of connections at Mexico City as well. But speaking of Volaris itself, so they have a very large presence at both Mexico City and Guadalajara. The main hub, and I don't think it's a main hub anymore, but like another major city where Volaris is very much dominant is Tijuana, right across the border from San Diego. which I'm sure you know very well, eh?
Uh huh.
Um, and so that's another, like, if you look at the list of destinations, right? Um, that's another area in which Volaris really much does really excels, and something which VivaAerobus, who is much newer on the scene, is certainly seeking to replicate as well as take away from, in having these sorts of very much very large point to point, well, point to point esque, shall we say, right? Destinations, in having multiple different hubs, multiple different flights to and from all of their
Hmm.
different all of their different major cities.
And yeah, in that Guadalajara specifically, I noticed at least the seven destinations Aeromexico flew to were all international.
Mm-hmm.
Which I guess is the one niche that they can have there that Volaris doesn't. But like that is reflected in the numbers. Like we've mentioned that Volaris is the largest domestic airline in Mexico, as compared to the other big two airlines, and that's not really surprising because they're cheaper and they have more services. Uh, and it seems more in I guess that Aeromexico is more focused on the premium market, and maybe even the premium travel to the U.S. Especially because they are in SkyTeam and focus heavily on their relationship with Delta,
Mm-hmm.
which Volaris I don't they ended their code share with Southwest to my knowledge. That's definitely not promoted anymore. So they're really more on their own, and I think certainly focused on their subsidiary expansion. It looks like they also have a subsidiary in Costa Rica as well, which is interesting. So they seem much more intent on staying, I guess, closer to Mexico and rather than
Mm-hmm.
expanding into the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, well, they obviously do have a lot of destinations in the United States as well, but it's for sure they're not trying to pull a sort of um, open up a American subsidiary. They're still very much Mexican, and it's for Volaris itself, right? It's actually, I think it speaks more volumes about Aeromexico and their failure just to have these sorts of very large, lots of connections to and from a bunch of places. So, for example, here I'll give you two examples, right? One is of course Cancun, right? World famous tourist destination, tons and tons and tons of flights from absolutely everywhere from all sorts of airlines just to capture that that oh so elusive touristy demand, right? Um, so of course, both Viva Aerobus and Volaris have large presences from flights all over the United States and Mexico. Aeromexico has two flights from Cancun. One is from Mexico City, and one is to and from Sao Paulo, which is set to begin actually this December. So
Huh.
that's
It's a
not.
interesting.
It's an interesting choice of Sao Paulo, but it's also an
Yeah.
interesting case of how little of a presence they have in what is quite literally Mexico's biggest tourist destination. Um, so there's that, and then I guess one other example would be a much less, shall we say, significant city relatively, the city of Querétaro, which is in it's also in central Mexico. It's a mid-sized city, right? Viva Aerobus has two flights, Cancun and Monterrey. Volaris has four flights, Cancun, Chicago O'Hare, Puerto Vallarta, and Tijuana, right? So both of them have presences, while as Aeromexico only has the Mexico City connection, right? Um, so it's pretty evident that it's more just hammering away at the point. Aeromexico really doesn't do a good job at capturing these key markets, um, even when they could really be needed from an airline in bankruptcy.
And it seems like those kinds of airlines, at least the huge, I guess, fortress airlines that have one major hub at one major airport, have really been fading out over time. Um,
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that's entirely the case, right? So you can look at some other big airlines like, um, well, of course, Emirates is in a class of its own. But for example, Air France and Singapore Airlines, right? Both of them are, there's not really, there's certainly competition, but they're not exactly going anywhere anytime soon. What I do think is what I do think is, like, for example, why we don't see this sort of situation in like the United States, for example, is that they're even in the United States, or where there's quite a few competitors to the established carriers, to United, Delta, American, is that the big airlines will compete and go for all sorts of demand. They're not just marketing themselves for business travelers, right? Um, for example, United very much also markets itself as a tourist airline, as one for travelers to flights to and from Colorado or Hawaii or Alaska or whatever, right? They're not stiff and rigid,
Right.
Like some of the other airlines are, like Aeromexico is, for example, and that's something which you don't really see happening in Mexico. Aeromexico just doesn't really want to compete with the other two, which is certainly great for Volaris and VivaAerobus. But you can't. Mexico City is certainly a very big market, but is it the end all be all? Even to go so far as to not even tap into such a tourist destination as Cancun, and I think that's a really big question that the Aeromexico executives need to ask.
And it's especially, I would think, concerning to Aeromexico that with Interjet now folding, and there's a lot of slots left in Mexico City up for grabs, that a lot of people have thought that might go to a revived and resurrected Mexicana. But if that doesn't happen, then there may be more opportunities for airlines like Volaris to take those slots and to continue to I guess, encroach on Aeromexico's territory. Because even if you just look at the destination list, like, Volaris is still gaining ground and has a quite sizable presence at Mexico City Airport.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and if Aeromexico loses out on that, as long as they can, I guess, maintain some sense of being premium, then they might be fine. But with the rise of low cost carriers, they have had to cut prices, and that was ultimately a major reason why Mexicana went broke, was because they charged extraordinarily low prices on flights that eventually would just become unsustainable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly, and just look at like what flights they're competing against, right? Aeromexico, they operate the international flights. For example, Mexico City to London Heathrow, they're competing against British Airways, right? Or for example, Mexico City to Sao Paulo, right? They're competing against LATAM. And while Aeromexico Connect, right, certainly does have, a decent network to and from Mexico City, they just completely fail almost entirely in the point-to-point models that VivaAerobus and Volaris offers, right? So in the end, it's Aeromexico doesn't really have that sort of domineering presence at any one capacity, right? Sure, you can fly to a bunch of places from Mexico City, but you can also fly those exact same routes from with a lot of other airlines as well. So it's not really a unique factor per se. It's more just, oh, here's another option, Aeromexico, right? It's not, for example, United's strategy of, expand somewhere. We're the only one, right? And then nobody else can come replace us. Or even, for example, the strategy of for example, Turkish Airlines, which is, fly everywhere, fly to all the countries, right? Aeromexico just doesn't really have it. It's sort of in between. It's not really one of either.
Yeah, I would say it's seemingly put emphasis into their international flights and their long haul product. I know they've gained some notoriety for their good business class product, and investing in a reverse herringbone cabin that I know has got a lot of good reviews, and their food as well across the board from economy to business class I know has gotten good reviews. But I mean, long haul flights, if in COVID especially, are not going to give you money. Uh, I mean, they might with passengers, but right now international travel being so uncertain, I don't know what how Aeromexico is going to fare in that regard. But also, one thing I wanted to bring up in terms of international travel is that actually, earlier this year, the FAA of the U.S. Downgraded the safety rating, or maybe upgraded in a sense, of Mexico to a Category 2. Uh,
Mm.
I guess system, which makes it so that airlines in Mexico can't launch new service to the U.S. They can only maintain existing service, and they also can't code share with U.S. airlines on flights they operate into the U.S. So, in terms of international travel to the U.S., there's a lot of uncertainty. I think right now for all airlines as to what the future holds. But I don't know. Do you think that's going to have a big impact on international travel
I think it
in
would
Mexico at
be.
least?
I think that is a very good question because Mexico has certainly they have not been you know pleased at this announcement. It basically puts them in all the it puts them in the same category as let me see, Bangladesh, Ghana, Pakistan, Venezuela, and Thailand. So not an amazing group of countries to be in, right? Especially for
No.
yeah. So I'm looking online, right? So here's this one quote: Mexico joins an exclusive, but not a luxurious club of countries under Category 2, right? Um, so I mean, I think it's a very good question, right? It's certainly critical for Mexican authorities and the airlines to regain Category 1 status, as soon as possible, right? But I mean, the well, basically what I think will happen is that right now there's a lot of travel on the existing routes, right? The demand to Cancun and all the flights to and from there are not going away anytime soon, which is pretty obvious. I do think that this will put I do think that this is if this were to happen, it would be now would sort of be the best time for it to happen, just because COVID is still a thing, and so there it won't being downgraded to Category 2 won't have that big of an impact, right? If this announcement were made in another year where COVID is not a thing, then it would probably be utterly devastating. But now they have time to act on it. They have time to regain Category 1 status. And during this time, right, since travel is already limited, even if they don't, capture key markets, even if they don't operate new routes, I don't think it will be that big of a deal because they can still do that later on, right? What do you think?
Mhm. Yeah, I wish I knew more about the process, but if they can recover, I guess, from this rating and change it pretty quickly, then yeah, I wouldn't be concerned about the effect on the industry. And I think the more critical piece is that flights that already fly to Mexico or to the U.S. from Mexico can stay in place. Like that's not changing. And I'm not actually sure there was actually a lot of desire on behalf of Mexican Airlines to launch more service, because we've seen already that the connections are already pretty strong between the two countries, and with a lot of flights and a lot of different airlines to a lot of different cities, especially the tourist cities like Cancun or San Jose de Cabo already have a ton of demand and a ton of supply. So I don't think it actually makes a huge impact, but I think the code sharing piece is probably a bit damaging for at least name recognition, because like when you have a code share, you have the ability to shift between airlines when booking tickets, which I guess increases the name recognition of some of these airlines to those who may have not considered them or heard about them. So that might be a bit damaging. But otherwise, I mean, yeah, you're right. With if COVID wasn't a thing, then and there was a lot of expansion plans, that would probably be discouraging and somewhat devastating for airlines like Volaris. But right now, yeah, it's not. I don't.
Well, I
make this
mean,
that big of a deal.
another thing which is critical to remember is that this has also been very much this announcement has also been very much beneficial for the domestic Mexican aviation because both Volaris and VivaAerobus announced following this change, this downgrade upgrade. I have no,
I guess you could call it a downgrade because that's what it does.
but it's going
Really.
up. It's category 1 to category 2, whatever, downgrade. So they announced like just after this downgrade that they would focus more on growing their domestic market, right? Opening up new connections in Mexico itself, which is certainly great for the country of Mexico. But it's also playing a part. Like for example, a part in other routes. For example, I think as we mentioned earlier, Volaris is opening up a route to Colombia, right? That's partially due to this announcement because they can't open up the new route in the United States. It gives them time to also focus on other markets, which there certainly might be demand for as well, and not just constantly be focused on the looming American market just up north.
And especially with a lot of the South American airlines like Avianca and Tom to some degree facing or Latam facing financial struggles. There's a lot more gaps to be filled in flight connections that really haven't been established in prior years to be filled in at least by a low cost carrier like Volaris. So I think that's actually really good for them. For shifting their priorities and focusing more on markets that may not have had I guess the low cost carrier fill them before. So I think that's actually a really good business decision on their part to shift their priorities.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But it also, what it also does contribute to as well is an even greater decline of Aeromexico. Since because of this new because again some of the biggest markets even to and from Mexico City are from the United States, right? And because of COVID a lot of those routes were sort of hampered, having not allowing Aeromexico to also open up additional routes to and from American cities to Mexico City would not be great for the airline. It certainly wouldn't have much of an impact on, the other two, as we've said, not that much at least. But because they already they are focusing very much on domestic and other Central and South America. But for connections to and from Mexico City, it's not so great.
That said, though, Aeromexico does already have an existing steady presence in the U.S., serving a lot of cities that aren't served by Volaris or VivaAerobus. So, I mean, I think if they had their routes cut altogether, I would be very concerned for them. But
Oh yeah.
at least they still have the lion's share of the market from Mexico to U.S. Operated by Mexican carriers, as compared to Volaris or VivaAerobus. So I mean, I think the decision for expansion into U.S. that certainly harms VivaAerobus and Volaris a lot more than Aeromexico, as I think we've seen in Volaris suddenly shifting more towards Colombia and El Salvador.
Yeah, I guess that could also be considered. But actually, though, I do want to sort of touch on the final airline that we have not discussed, which is VivaAerobus itself, right? The one that I flew on that ever so fateful 12 to 4 a.m. So VivaAerobus, well, first of all, right? Obviously, they're the other low-cost carrier. Much like how we discussed before, just like how Volaris also has a major presence in Tijuana, where the other airlines are not exactly so dominant. VivaAerobus has sort of the same situation in Monterrey, and so as a result of that, right? VivaAerobus is also firmly in the Mexican aviation market, much like Volaris with the large point-to-point model serving cities all over. But they actually only began services. They only began to exist in 2006, which is certainly not. It wouldn't be expected for an airline to pop completely new onto the scene, and then all of a sudden, right, be much more, and then just 15 years later, be even more dominant than the well-established Aeromexico.
They have grown incredibly quickly. You're right, and at least that seems to me way more of a product of just pre 2006. There was no low cost airline whatsoever in Mexico. And you have Volaris and VivaAerobus starting up at the around the exact same time, which I think was beneficial to both of them because it lowered prices countrywide, and it forced Mexicana out of business essentially because they couldn't compete, and that made it even easier for VivaAerobus to just take more of the market share because Mexicana was the largest airline in Mexico, so it left a lot of holes that they could fill pretty easily. So in some ways, the time they started up at in 2006 was really key. Also, because like around that same time we saw the effects of 9/11 on the airline industry. I guess it was more of a U.S. centered thing, but it still affected airlines. And then you had around 2008 the Great Recession that occurred, which also really damaged the big airlines that people couldn't afford to fly as much. So there was a lot of factors that really affected the bigger airlines that had a much smaller profit margin. That VivaAerobus and most of Volaris could really hedge themselves against. So I'm not, I guess, surprised at their growth, but it is really astonishing how fast they have grown.
Well, it's also interesting on what their initial focuses were, right? It's the airline from the get go sort of really did make an effort to brand itself as very low cost. Just I believe in 2007, VivaAerobus began the first international flight to Austin, Texas, right? And then it says initially served Austin from Austin to Cancun, Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Leon, right? So very much again the sort of point-to-point model, instead of having the big established one hub, right? And it's also interesting because VivaAerobus did not even begin service to. It did not even actually here. It did not. I'm sorry. It did not. Begin to enhance services, right? Expand services at Mexico City until 2010, right? And that was when after Mexicana just shut down, VivaAerobus sort of stepped in and filled that market of demand to and from Mexico City. So it was only 4 years after inception that this supposed low cost carrier of Mexico began service to the big Mexico City, which sort of really sets it apart as well, much like Volaris. But nowadays, right? I remember going to Mexico 5 years ago when I went to Cancun. I just flew American to and from Chicago and Cancun, and I remember at that time, right, looking at plane tickets to and from Cancun and Mexico City, and just seeing VivaAerobus pop up. So they are certainly, they certainly have a presence that's taken already, but even it's been 15 years now, and they are capturing a lot of the market, right? Even though, for example, that flight that I took from Chicago to Mexico City, even though it was in the dead of night, right, the plane was almost packed full. Like there were only a few seats that were left empty. So they're certainly doing a good job of looking at and finding their market as well.
Yeah, and at least from what I could grasp, just looking at the FaceTime video, but it seemed like the flight to Guadalajara also had quite a heavy share of people using it, um, and that's also during COVID as well, where there are a lot of restrictions. So I mean, it's crazy how much they've been able to fill planes. Um, and maybe it's just that there's a travel bug and people pick the cheapest airline, so of course they're gonna
Hmm.
land on VivaAerobus. But I mean,
Yeah, I mean
I
that's
mean
only
it's clearly working.
yeah, that's only what happened with me. I mean, also because there's not really any travel restrictions between the United States and Mexico, so it's certainly much easier. It puts travelers right into the market of Viva Aerobus and Volaris, versus, for example, if you're coming from Europe, right, where there are lots of travel restrictions, as well as just being from Europe intrinsically, right? You're sort of forced to either take a European airline or Aeromexico, or transfer in the United States or wherever else, right? So for the United States market, the big touristy demand is the big touristy, and the demand from the diaspora. It sort of falls right into Viva Aerobus and Volaris's hands, just because both of them are you know both groups of demand, both groups of the market really want to save money types of people, right?
Hmm. And it's surprising, and it's actually kind of cool just how in a almost symbiotic way Viva Orbis and Volaris are, because they both managed to be incredibly successful in a huge country with similar business models, but they also have managed to find out their to create their own stake almost, that with Viva Orbis having a lot of flights out of Monterrey, and Volaris having a lot of flights out of Guadalajara and Tijuana. And I guess that's overall just a good thing for the people looking to get in the skies, because you have a low cost carrier somewhere around the country that can get you where you want to go, and you don't have to fly through Mexico City to get there like you would have if you were trying to fly Aeromexico, which would pretty much force you to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe we're just seeing a late development of the industry, because I mean in the U.S. we've seen low cost carriers flourish for a while, starting with Southwest, and maybe uh, it's just a late development from having two monopolistic airlines, and now we're seeing the
Mm-hmm.
effects of some of those codes. Like I mean, in the U.S. we saw Pan Am and TWA eventually fold because they had a lot of pressure from low cost airlines, and I guess obsolete business practices and um, business models. Uh, so in a sense, I think it's just some late development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can really compare it to, like, for example, if you look at the European Union as one country, right? You have all those different low cost carrier options: Ryanair, EasyJet, Wizz Air, all the rest. So I guess it's really convenient in that regard. But I mean, I don't know if there's really a comparable. I don't know if there's really a comparable situation in any other country in the world where you have sort of like more like two or more major low cost carriers, sort of competing in the same space. I'm trying to think of one, but I mean, I guess you could say India,
Yeah, I
maybe,
mean, India maybe.
maybe
I
not.
mean, in Europe it's hard because the boundaries are so small
Yeah,
within the
teeny
country.
tiny.
They're more multinational.
Yeah, and there's no situation like this in the United States or China or Russia.
I guess in South Africa you have Mango and Kalula, but they're both, I don't think, that focused on low cost.
Yeah, they're not. So I guess sort of Mexico and India per se, right? So it's very rare in the world to see something like this, basically, right? Um, so it's really interesting what they've done, and I mean, I guess with the in the future, it's certainly as with almost any topic, right? Um, it's certainly not completely impossible that there will be another shift in the market, another shift in the airlines as well, be it in either more airlines opening up or in mergers as well. Eh?
And actually, one thing that we probably should mention at some point that we haven't yet is that at least for for 5 years there was a discussion of building a completely new Mexico City airport
Mm-hmm.
in a faraway suburb that
Mm-hmm.
would drastically expand the capacity of the airport, and I would imagine allow for far more slots given to all the airlines, which I think we would see some repercussions. But that was canceled, and for now we're still stuck with the situation where there's not a lot of capacity to grow at all at the existing airport,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess that makes it harder for slots to be allocated to the point where if like a new Mexicana were to be resurrected, it would have to take slots from Interjet because that's all that's available. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to mention that if the new airport were to go through, we'd see a lot of different dynamics than we are now.
Yeah, if the New York were to go through it, it would have been absolutely massive. Um, I think it was said somewhere that it was going to be the largest in the world, which lots of airlines were sort of competing for that title. Lots of airports, I'm sorry. And that, I guess that would have really changed the situation because certainly. Well, certainly, it would have also depended on how it played out, right? It's not impossible that could have ended up in a Montreal Mirabel situation where a big new airport is built far away, but nobody wants to use it. Um, but I guess if that sort of happened, it would be interesting to think about what would have happened, right? Would that be a bigger boost to Aeromexico and their international flights, or more capacity for connections to and from low cost destinations for Volaris and VivaAerobus?
I would have thought that it'd probably benefit everyone because it would probably, and I don't know how the slots would be allocated, but I'd imagine it'd give them equally, and then also try to expand the international carriers that serve the airport, because that's obviously a challenge now that you still have to get slots to launch services, and also the altitude too makes it harder to have international flights. So if you can expand the runways or do stuff like that, you can also bring new airlines into the market. But it is really sad that it was canceled because it cost a lot of money to start construction, and then they just completely wasted it. And yeah, actually looking at it, they plan to have it looks like 6 different runways all over 14,000 feet, which or 13,000 feet, which is I guess similar to Denver, where you can have a lot of big planes land even in the altitude because you have such long runways.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just a bummer it was canceled, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure, as some people would say, that is Mexico, right? The government takes a lot of money into building something, but then falls back on it after the money has been spent. Eh?
Hmm. And it does say on the Wikipedia that there may be a new airport built somewhere else at an Air Force base, presumably at a cheaper cost. So I mean, I think it's clearly necessary for a new airport to be built because you probably experience it, like the airport now is fine, but it's cramped in terms of its capacity to I guess create new terminals or to have new airlines serve the airport. So I would think a new airport is needed, and hopefully they move on that soon.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see. Maybe. They announced before they were going to build this one, but maybe next time we'll fly into Mexico City into the new airport. Who knows?
And but I mean yeah, but Volaris and VivaAerobus may also try to get you to fly into the Toluca airport, which at one point, as we
Well,
mentioned,
Viva was
was an alternative.
well, Viva was didn't do that this time for me, so that's good.
But yeah, anyway, that mostly concludes our episode on Mexican aviation. Obviously, I think it's pertinent to talk about now with Jiahao being in Mexico City, having just flown Viva Aerobus and discussing that. But if you have any other thoughts on Mexican related aviation content, um, now would be the time to mention it. But yeah, otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed listening to this episode. And for the next 2 weeks, Jiahao will be in Mexico City Um, so look forward to hearing content from that as well.